recently did was take my Tesla Model 3 long range on a long distance trip, my first one, breaking it in. I went from Fresno to Los Angeles, and anybody who's ever made that drive knows that you have to go up the grapevine, which is not an easy task for most drivers. Fortunately, I've done it hundreds of times. So I'm going to give you guys the math and the breakdown on just how good the range works on the Model 3 long range Tesla. So I started in Fresno, California. I left the supercharging station, which is on Herndon and 99. And as you can see, when I unplugged, I had a range of 343 miles. Now, the distance to my location that I was going to was 243 miles. Obviously, you would think by seeing that, you should be able to make it on a full charge, but I'm gonna give you guys a breakdown on why maybe you can and why maybe you can't. So my first stop was at Wheeler Ridge, which is just south of Bakersfield. It's right before you go up the Grapevine. Now, going from Fresno to Wheeler Ridge, remember I started with 343 miles. By the time I arrive at Wheeler Ridge, and the drive takes 145 miles, now as you can see, going from 343 to 145, it actually burned 228 miles of energy off of my battery pack. Now, full disclaimer, I was averaging about 80 miles an hour. Now, I have 115 miles range left on the battery, but I have 98 miles left to go on my trip. So, to play it safe, I recharged at the supercharger to 262 miles range on the battery pack. Now, when I left Wheeler Ridge with that 262 miles of range on the battery pack, it takes 15.2 miles to get to the top of the Grapevine, which anybody who's ever driven that Grapevine from Bakersfield to the LA area knows is a pretty daunting task, even for the most experienced driver. However, when I get to the top of Grapevine, which is known as Tejon Pass, I have 212 miles of range left. Well, since I started with 262 miles of battery pack, I actually burned 50 miles of energy in only 15.2 miles. Now, from the top of Tejon Pass, the next checkpoint you want to keep an eye out for would be the Burbank Supercharger. Now, from Tejon Pass to the Burbank Supercharger, the distance is 58.1 miles. However, on that drive, I only burned 50 miles of range, leaving me with 162 miles of range, which is actually a +8 positive of mileage. Now, to finish the rest of my journey was only going to take me 25.3 miles from the Burbank Supercharger to my destination. However, it only burns 24 miles of range. Keep in mind, I pretty much average 80 miles an hour the whole trip. So when I arrived at my destination, I still had 138 miles of range left on the pack. Now, if you add up all the miles burned in between stops and checkpoints, from the 228 to the 50 to the 50 to the 24, all that range actually burns up 353 miles of range. So if you consider we started with the 343 mile range on the pack, there's your 343 right there, but considering all the miles burned per stop, per checkpoint, it actually came out to 353 miles. So if you do the accumulation, you end up getting a -9 when you're trying to reach a destination. Now, keep in mind, the total drive was 243 miles. Given that you started with 343 miles, you actually lose a total of 100 miles from a full battery pack to the arrival of your trip.
While we're in intermission, if you could just smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Also, don't be afraid to share and subscribe. Also want to give a shout out to Ari Ray Activewear. Ladies, go to ariray.com. It has all your workout gear and activewear, tops, bottoms, anything you're looking for. Go to ariray.com. I will leave a link in the description.
Now, what goes up must come down. Considering that I live in Fresno, I got to come back from LA. So from my starting point in LA, it actually takes 51.1 miles to the Valencia supercharger. Now, I didn't have to stop at the Valencia supercharger, but in case I did, I actually burned 72 miles of range, which left me with 264 miles left to go. Now, from the Valencia supercharger back to the top of the Tejon Pass, it's actually 35.5 miles. But on that journey, it actually burns 64 miles of range. So when I get to the top of Tejon Pass, I'm only left with 200 miles of range. Now, once I reach the top of the Tejon Pass, it's another 15.2 miles if you remember from Wheeler Ridge to the top. Now we're going from the top to the bottom. Let's say I needed a recharge. It would take me 15.2 miles to get there. However, going down the Grapevine, I actually gained 9 miles of range on the pack. So when I would want to stop at Wheeler Ridge, I would actually have 206 miles of range on the pack. Now let's say I had stopped at Wheeler Ridge, which I didn't this time, but on my way back home, I do like to stop off at a Denny's in Bakersfield. It's about 22.7 miles from Wheeler Ridge. However, in that 22.7 miles, I only burned 21 miles of pack, which actually, when you think about it, I got 1 mile back on the pack. So when I arrive at the Denny's in Bakersfield, which I didn't stop at, by the way, I had 185 miles of range left on the pack. Now, from that Denny's in Bakersfield, every now and then on my way home, if I have time, most of the time I don't, but sometimes I like to stop at the outlets in the city of Tulare. Now, from that Denny's to the outlets, 69.8 miles. However, I'm not really going downhill anymore, so I'm not getting as much mileage, and I'm actually burning 83 miles in that 69.8 miles. So by the time I arrive at the outlets in Tulare, I only have 102 miles of range left. Now, fair disclaimer, this time I did not stop at the outlets in Tulare in the interest of saving time because I was trying to get home. However, after Tulare, there's only one supercharger before I arrive back at home. That's in Traver. It's a nice supercharger. It's got about 12 stalls at it. So I figured, okay, why not take a little stop, take a little break on the drive. About 18 miles from Tulare, but averaging 80 miles an hour and not going downhill anymore, mind you. I actually burned 25 miles of range on the pack. So when I arrive at Traver, I only have 77 miles of range left. So while I'm in Traver, pull up in the supercharger, a recharge to 182 miles range, well more than enough to get me back to my house. However, I figured why not stop, get a quick bite to eat, nice little couple gas stations that have some drinks and food. Why not help yourself? So after recharging to 182 at the Traver supercharger, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, Traver, I have 37 more miles to go before I arrive home. Now, everybody on the road's driving like a maniac, and I'm pretty much going to keep up myself, so we're all averaging 85 miles an hour. But in that 37 miles, I actually burned 49.1 miles of range. So when I arrive back at my house, I actually have 132 miles of range left on the charge. Okay, now, considering that I did start the trip with 336 miles, and considering all the miles that I burned, plus what I gained in between each stop and checkpoint, I actually only burned 305 miles of range on the trip. Now, considering I started with 336, when I arrived back home, that actually left me with 31 miles of range. So even though the total drive is 243 miles, I did burn 305 total miles of range on the pack. However, having arrived with 31 miles left of range on the pack, I could have probably made it home without stopping at the supercharger in Traver. So in the 2021 Model 3 long range, you can definitely push it. It is rated at 353 miles of range on a full pack. I would say, yeah, you can take it to about 340 or so if you're really feeling confident about it. However, I wouldn't recommend it. Take your time, stop at some superchargers, or if there's no superchargers along the way, do your best to download some apps that have charging stations along the way if you have an adapter. It'll really help you out, and I definitely think you can make it to where you really want to go.